My grandmother's house smelled like cedar and old wool and something I could never name. The particular warmth of a place that had been lived in fully, the way only a home that's absorbed 40 years of ordinary life can smell. She kept a small ceramic dish by the front door where she dropped her keys every single evening, and I can still hear the sound they made when they landed. A small, clean clink. Like punctuation at the end of a long day. She didn't leave me the house in a dramatic reading of her will. There was no gathering of relatives around a mahogany table. My grandmother, who had worked 31 years as a night shift nurse at a hospital in Sudbury, and who had raised 2 children mostly alone after my grandfather passed, sat me down at her kitchen table. The winter I turned 27, poured 2 cups of tea, and slid a folder across to me. Inside was the deed to the property, already transferred, already done. She had handled it quietly, the way she handled most things. She said, "I want to see your face when I give it to you." That's the point. I cried into my tea. She didn't. She patted my hand once and told me not to let the emotion make me forget to call the insurance company. That house in Sudbury had been in her name since 1987. She bought it with her own money, her own credit, no cosigner, in a time when a woman doing that alone was still something people commented on. She was proud of that, quietly. She never made speeches about it, but I saw it in the way she talked about the front porch, the way she referred to the property line, the specific way she said "my house," without possessiveness but with precision, like it mattered to say it correctly. When I moved in with my husband 3 years ago, I brought all of that with me. The ceramic dish by the door, the smell that had somehow absorbed itself into the walls, the understanding that this address was not incidental to my life. It was the most concrete thing my grandmother had ever handed me, and what she had handed me was 31 years of night shifts, and every vacation she hadn't taken, and every large purchase she'd deferred. My husband, I'll call him my husband because that's what he still is, and because names don't really matter for the part of this story that's important, was supportive in the beginning. Or I believed he was. He understood what the house meant when I told him. He held my hand while I described my grandmother crying when she realized she'd outlived the mortgage. He nodded in all the right places. He said he was honored to live there. I believed him. That was the first mistake I can name clearly. The change arrived the way most damaging things do. Not as an event, but as a gradual accumulation of small moments that each seemed dismissible on its own. He started mentioning his sister more. Just in passing, at first. His sister was in between apartments. His sister was having a hard stretch financially. His sister had always gotten along well with me, hadn't she? And wasn't that rare, really, to get along so well with a sister-in-law? I agreed that it was. I liked his sister well enough. We had a cordial relationship built on mutual respect and the unspoken agreement not to spend too much time alone together. That's not a criticism, it's just accurate. We were friendly the way people are friendly when they're choosing to be, not because the connection runs deep. The comments about his sister continued. Then, one evening in February, I remember the month because we'd just gotten a heavy snowfall, and the driveway needed to be cleared, and I was thinking about that while he talked. He told me he'd been thinking seriously about the upstairs bedroom, the one I used as a small home office. He said his sister could use it temporarily, just a few months, while she sorted out her situation. I asked him to clarify what he meant by sorted out her situation. He said she needed time to rebuild her savings. Maybe 6 months, he thought, maybe closer to a year, but probably less. I told him I needed to think about it. He said, "Of course," in the easy tone of someone who has already decided the answer. That tone is the thing I keep returning to when I try to understand how we got to where we eventually landed. It wasn't the request itself. People have complicated family situations. Finances get difficult. I understand that. What unsettled me was the ease of the assumption underneath the request. The assumption that the house was the kind of resource he could propose allocating without a real conversation, without uncertainty, without waiting to see how I felt. 3 weeks later, I came home from work to find his mother sitting on my porch. Not his sister, his mother. Sitting in the wicker chair I'd brought from my grandmother's sunroom, with a tote bag on her lap and an expression of complete comfort, like someone waiting at an airport gate she'd been to many times. She stood when I came up the walk and kissed my cheek and said she'd been thinking it over, her phrase, thinking it over, as though she'd been deliberating something that was hers to deliberate, and had decided that the plan made more sense if she came too. To help, she said. To ease the transition, to be present for her daughter. I stood on my own front walk and felt the cold coming up through my boots. I asked her inside. I made coffee. I did these things automatically because I was processing what had just happened and my body needed something to do while my mind caught up. She talked for a long time. She talked about family, the way she defined it, interconnected, fluid, not bound by paperwork or legal designations. She talked about how in their family, difficulty was met collectively. She said my husband had always been generous, and she hoped I understood that his generosity came from the values she'd raised him with, and she hoped I shared those values. Every sentence was constructed to make a disagreement sound like a character flaw. I recognized the architecture of it. I had heard manipulative framing before, just not in my own kitchen, delivered to me over coffee I had made. Then she said she'd like a key. She said it simply, between sips, as though it were an administrative detail we were getting to after the important things had been decided. She said it would be practical, given that she'd be coming and going, and she didn't want to disturb us every time. The room went quiet in the specific way. Rooms go quiet when something has shifted and everyone in them knows it. I could hear the furnace cycling on somewhere in the basement. I could hear snow starting to move against the kitchen window, and I felt something settle in my chest. Not anger, though anger was there, but something beneath it. A steadiness, the kind that arrives when confusion lifts and what's underneath it is simply clarity. I looked at her. She was looking back at me with the patient, expectant expression of someone who believed the next thing I said would be of course, or let me get my spare set. I set down my mug. I said, I think we need to talk about what this house is and what it isn't. And I'd like my husband in the room when we do. But before I tell you what happened when the three of us were sitting at that table, before I tell you what I said that made her stop mid-sentence and made my husband set down his phone very slowly and carefully, like he was afraid of making noise, I need you to understand what my grandmother actually did to give me this house. Because the words I used only make sense against the weight of everything they were carrying. My grandmother worked nights for 31 years. Not occasionally. Reliably, consistently, through shift work that dismantled normal sleep and made holidays complicated and meant she was present for my childhood in fragments. A Saturday morning here, an afternoon there, rearranged around a schedule that never fully accommodated the life she was trying to live alongside it. She told me once that the hardest part wasn't the exhaustion. It was the feeling of always being slightly out of sync with everyone else's rhythms. The world was moving in one direction, and she was always catching up. She drove a 2003 Hyundai Elantra until it could not legally pass an emissions test. She took one trip in 30 years, a long weekend to Prince Edward Island, which she planned for 2 years and talked about for longer than that afterward. She bought her winter coat at a Goodwill in 2009 and wore it until 2021, when my mother finally replaced it as a birthday gift. The house in Sudbury was the accumulation of every one of those choices. Every deferred thing, every held-back want. It was not an accident or a windfall. It was the specific result of a specific life, chosen deliberately and paid for completely. And when she slid that folder across the kitchen table and said she wanted to see my face, she was handing me all of that. Not just the legal document, the whole weight of what it represented. I was not going to hand any part of that to someone who had arrived at my front door with a tote bag and a plan. My husband came in from the garage. I'd texted him while I was getting a glass of water. I asked him to come inside and sit down. He came in with the expression of a man who has begun to understand that a situation has developed beyond his initial assessment. We sat at the kitchen table. The same table I'd brought from my grandmother's house. Round, maple, with one leg that had been repaired, and you could see where if you knew where to look. I told them both, calmly, that I wanted to clarify something before this conversation went any further. I told them that this house was not my husband's to offer. I said that directly, without softening it, because it was the sentence that needed to be said clearly or nothing else would land correctly. My mother-in-law started to say something about family and shared lives and how ownership looked different when you were genuinely committed to. I let her finish. I didn't interrupt. That was deliberate. I wanted her to use up the version of this conversation she'd rehearsed so we could move to the real one. When she finished, I said, "This house was transferred to me by my grandmother 3 years ago. My name is on the deed. Only my name. My husband's name is not on the deed. His name is not on the title. There is no joint ownership. There is no shared legal interest. This house belongs to me, and it belongs to me because my grandmother worked 31 years of night shifts and made 31 years of quiet sacrifices to accumulate the means to give it to me, and I watched her do it, and I know what it cost her, and I am not going to treat her 31 years as a resource that can be reallocated over coffee." I stood up. I went to the filing cabinet in the upstairs office, the office that had briefly been discussed as a bedroom without my consent, and I took out the folder my grandmother had organized the day she transferred the deed. She had organized it the way she organized everything: tabs, chronological order, each document in a clear sleeve. She had written my name on the outside in her handwriting, which is small and precise, and something I would know anywhere. I brought it to the table. I opened it to the transfer document. I turned it so it faced them. I pointed to my name. I did not say anything while they read it. I gave them the time to look at it completely, because I wanted there to be no version of this afterward where either of them could say they hadn't fully understood. My mother-in-law looked at the document for a long time. My husband looked at it too, and then he looked at the table, and then he looked at nothing in particular, which is where a person looks when they're having a realization they had managed to avoid until this exact moment. I told my mother-in-law that she was welcome in my home as a guest, that I had no personal hostility toward her, that I didn't want to damage the relationship between my husband and his family, because I understood that relationship mattered, and I wasn't asking him to choose between us. But that the conversation about a key, about a bedroom, about coming and going as though this were a property with shared access, that conversation was done. It had ended the moment she said the word key, and she would leave today understanding that. She did not respond immediately. She looked at me for a moment and then down at the document again, and I saw something rearrange itself in her expression. It wasn't anger, not yet. It was something more like recalibration, the particular adjustment a person makes when the room they've walked into is not the room they had planned for. She picked up her tote bag. She thanked me for the coffee. She said it was a lovely home. She left. My husband drove her to the hotel downtown. She hadn't been staying anywhere yet, which told me the plan had been more immediate than I'd understood. And he came back 2 hours later and sat across from me at the maple table and didn't say anything for a while. When he finally spoke, he said, "I didn't think it through." I told him I knew that. He said he had been so focused on solving his family's problem that he had stopped seeing the shape of what he was asking. I told him I needed him to understand that the problem wasn't the ask itself. The problem was the assumption underneath it, the assumption that my grandmother's house was part of a shared pool of resources that he could draw from without a full conversation, without my genuine agreement, without even a moment of uncertainty about whether I might feel differently than he did. He said he understood that now. I told him understanding it now was the only version of understanding it available to us, so we would have to work from there. We spent the next month in the most honest conversations we'd had since we got together. Not comfortable ones, honest ones, which are different. Things that had been coasting below the surface came up. About whose family got prioritized and how, about what assumptions we'd each been carrying without naming them, about the gap between what we said we believed about fairness and how we actually behaved when something was inconvenient. It was difficult in the way that real things usually are. And it was also the first time I felt like we were building something deliberately instead of just occupying the same space. His mother is cordial with me now. Not warm, not the way warmth happens naturally without effort, but respectful. She says what she needs to say, I say what I need to say, and there's a kind of careful honesty between us that I actually find more sustainable than the performance of warmth would have been. She knows where the boundaries are. I don't have to reinforce them every time. His sister found a place in Toronto. She got there without my guest room, and she seems to be fine. There are 2 things I've thought about since that I want to say clearly because I wish someone had said them to me before any of this happened. The first is about silence. I stayed quiet for too long when the early comments about his sister started. I didn't say, clearly and early, that's not something I'm able to offer. I stayed quiet because I wanted to be generous, and because I was afraid that naming the boundary would sound like I was withholding something. But silence in those moments isn't generosity. It reads as availability. And when I finally did speak, it had to carry the weight of all the weeks I hadn't. If something is yours, I mean genuinely, legally, historically yours, you don't have to wait until someone asks for it directly before you clarify the limits. You can clarify them whenever the conversation starts moving in that direction. The second thing is about paperwork. My grandmother put my name on that deed alone. She made that choice deliberately, and I think she understood things I didn't fully understand at the time. About how assets disappear when ownership gets assumed rather than specified. About how quickly something yours can become something shared when no one pauses to check the actual documents. That folder she organized with the tabs in the clear sleeves and my name on the outside. She gave me a house, but she also gave me the evidence that it was mine. I'm grateful for that on a level I didn't entirely have words for until I placed it in front of two people who needed to see it. The house still smells the same, cedar and old wool and something warm underneath. The ceramic dish is still by the door, and every evening when I come home, I drop my keys into it and hear that small, clean sound. My grandmother's 31 years are still in these walls. The keys are exactly where she put them, in my hands.